Hi there, let's talk about how to write a great comparative thesis statement. Now, remember that this video is building off of my previous video that I did on single text analyses. So if you haven't watched that previous video, the link is here on the screen. In particular, remember that your comparative thesis does still need to avoid the same 6 issues that I talked about in my previous video. Those are the topic sentence, the question format, preview of arguments, vagueness, being untenable or unprovable, and being true but obvious. So if you're uncertain about any of those, go back and watch that previous video again for some more about it. When you're ready to actually start writing your comparative thesis, you should start by asking yourself 3 questions. The first question is, what 2 things are you comparing? Are you going to compare 2 people, 2 characters? Are there 2 actions that you want to compare, or a similar action that occurs in both texts? Is the same theme dealt with in both texts, and do you want to look at that? Or are there 2 symbols or a similar symbol in both texts that you want to compare? Or is there something else? The key here is that you want to pick something specific that you're comparing. Don't just try to compare some broad concept like all the characters in the book or all the themes or something like that. You need something really specific. Otherwise, your thesis is going to end up in a very vague format. Once you have your 2 things you're going to compare, you can move on to question 2, which is, what is the point of comparison between these 2 people or things? In other words, are you going to focus on a particular similarity or a particular difference? It's okay to look a bit at both, but you want your main focus, your main interest, to be on just one or the other. And you want it to be a specific similarity or difference. Don't just broadly say, oh, these 2 things are dealt with in a similar way. That is going to be too vague for a thesis. Then your third question is, why are you comparing these 2 things to each other? In other words, why is this comparison important or noteworthy? Sometimes the answer to this is that it helps us to understand something deeper about one or both of the characters you may be comparing. It might help us to understand a greater message about people or life in general. Maybe it helps us to understand the themes in the text better. Maybe it helps us to reflect on our own lives as readers. Also, sometimes your similarity or difference that you're looking at is surprising, and maybe you want to look a little further at the text to try to explain why that similarity is there or why that difference is there. Then once you've got these 3 questions answered, then you start actually wording your thesis statement. The way I'm going to suggest you do this is by writing 3 separate sentences. The first 2 sentences are not going to be your actual thesis. They're going to be part of your introduction paragraph for your essay, and they're going to set up the context for your actual thesis. Now, this is also not the only way to write a comparative thesis statement, but I do recommend it for students who are new to this idea of writing comparative theses. It works well, and I think it helps to make the concept of the comparative thesis a little easier to work with. So anyway, if you are more interested in the point of difference between your 2 things that you're comparing, then this formula number 1 is the way you're going to go. Your first sentence is going to start by pointing out the way that your 2 items are similar. This can be absolutely obvious, and that is fine. It's a good starting point. It's not going to be the main thing you're focusing on. Then, in your second sentence, explain the point of difference. Talk about the perhaps less obvious way that your 2 things are different from each other. And then finally, in your third sentence, explain why we care about this less obvious difference. Explain, does it help us to understand something better? Does it help us to reflect on ourselves in some way? Or perhaps your point of difference is surprising. So maybe go on and look at the text more deeply to try to describe or explain why that difference is there. These are the sorts of things you want to put in your third sentence. Now, formula 2 here is what you will use if you're more interested in the point of similarity. It's pretty much the same as Formula 1. The only difference is my little tuning fork image there has flipped upside down. Now your first sentence is going to be about the way that your two items are different from each other. And that will be probably the most obvious part of what you're writing here. Then the less obvious point of similarity will be your second sentence. And then third, you'll explain why we care about the similarity or how we can explain it. Now do watch out. Whichever way you decide to write, whether you're more focused on the similarity or the difference, do make sure that your similarity and your difference are linked to each other in some way. Otherwise, what you write is going to end up sounding a little bit tangential, and your thesis may not make much sense. Here's an example of a bad thesis. Both Sally and John enjoy spending all of their time reading books. While Sally likes to eat pizza, however, John prefers sushi. This difference in taste shows that John is more refined than Sally. Now, the second two sentences here link to each other and follow each other logically, but that first sentence is totally out there. It's talking about reading books, and the next two sentences have nothing to do with books. So this is an example of where the similarity and the difference are not linked to each other, and it's causing a writing issue here. You can fix it by writing something like this. Both Sally and John enjoy spending all of their time reading books. While Sally likes to read the Twilight series, however, John prefers to read Shakespeare. This difference in taste shows that the choice to read is not an indicator of intelligence by itself. Now, this is sort of a flippant example here, but the point I'm trying to make is that both those first and second sentences are dealing with the idea of reading books. They're still linked within that broad action, and they have something in common. So this way, your three sentences are following each other logically. Do also notice, just like I mentioned earlier, that it is really the third sentence that is going to be your actual thesis statement. Those first two sentences won't be underlined as your thesis. They're just part of your introduction paragraph that are setting up the context. Now let's end by looking at an example comparative thesis statement that actually is dealing with literary texts. I am going to use the examples of The Island of Dr. Moreau and Heart of Darkness. These are two stories about characters who travel to exotic lands, see a lot of people die in really horrible ways, and then return back home again. And Prendick from The Island of Dr. Moreau sort of freaks out and holds himself up and won't talk to anybody anymore, while Marlowe continues to sort of live life normally as a sailor. So here's the example thesis. Prendick from The Island of Dr. Moreau and Marlowe from Heart of Darkness both face the darkness of death during their adventures. However, while Prendick's experience leads him to withdraw from society, Marlowe continues to travel and engage with others. Marlowe's ability to remain a functioning member of society stems from the fact that he finds a deeper meaning in his experience, while Prendick merely loses himself in the horror of death. So let's break this down into its three components. Prendick from The Island of Dr. Moreau and Marlowe from Heart of Darkness both face the darkness of death during their adventures. So here I am comparing two characters, Prendick and Marlowe, and the way that I'm comparing them for their similarity is something that is extremely obvious. Not only is nobody going to disagree with this statement, it's really a fundamental aspect of the entire novels. It's the basis of the novel's plots. But what this first point of similarity is going to do is it's going to allow me to segue into my point of difference, which does build off of that obvious point of similarity. However, while Prendick's experience leads him to withdraw from society, Marlowe continues to travel and engage with others. So yes, I'm starting with that obvious similarity, but then I'm looking at what the end point of that similarity is. And that end point is very different in the way these two characters end up. This is something that also is somewhat obvious. You do need to engage with the text to a certain degree to be able to come up with this conclusion about the way that these characters end up. But at the same time, it is something that no one is really going to disagree with this statement for the most part. And because of that, if I were to stop at this sentence, I would not have a strong thesis statement. I would have something that was true but obvious. So then what I do is I move to that why do we care question with my third sentence. And here what I've done is I've said, okay, I have this really obvious similarity, I have a slightly less obvious point of difference, and that difference is a little bit surprising. If these two guys both have these horrific experiences but somehow manage to have very different outcomes, well, how do I explain away those different outcomes? What's the reason for them? Is there something that we can do in our lives to help us deal with trauma so that we don't become hermits holed up from society? So that's where I come up with my third sentence here. Marlowe's ability to remain a functioning member of society stems from the fact that he finds a deeper meaning in his experience, while Prendick merely loses himself in the horror of death. So here, this idea of can we find meaning in trauma? Can we find meaning in horror? This, if you're able to do it, is the way to survival, essentially. So this is this broad message, this broad decision I'm coming away with. It is something that not everyone will necessarily agree with. People may not agree that meaning is the reason that one character acts differently than the other. They may even disagree with whether there's meaning in Marlowe's journey at all, or they may believe that Prendick does find meaning but melts down anyway. The point being here is that this is something people will disagree with. It is my opinion. It is something that I'm going to need to engage with the text at length to be able to prove why my opinion is right. So again, this is just one example of a comparative thesis. There's lots of different ways you can engage with similarities and differences in that why do we care question. But the key thing to keep in mind here is that the first point, whether it's your similarity or difference, can be extremely obvious. Your second point can still be somewhat true but obvious, but should be a little less so. And then that third question, the why do we care sentence, is your actual thesis and is the most important aspect of your overall setup here. And that concludes the video. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I hope you have a lot of fun writing your comparative thesis statement.